Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Clements, CEO of American Promise, and you are listening to another episode of the 4R Freedom podcast about money and politics in America. And today I am joined by Derek Monson of the Sutherland Institute. It's a think tank based in Salt Lake City, covers Utah and beyond. The mission of the Sutherland Institute is to equip Americans to advance principled public policy that promotes the constitutional values of faith, family, and freedom. Derek is Sutherland's Chief Growth Officer, overseeing operations, expansion, and policy. And over the years, he has offered expert commentary on a wide range of topics, including education, elections, family, and religious freedom. He is a longtime Utahn, a father of three. We have that in common, Derek. And we are excited to have him join us today. Welcome, Derek. It's really good to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. I'm glad to be on the podcast. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right. And Derek, for listeners who don't know about Sutherland Institute, tell us a little bit more about it and how you go about advancing the values that I described from your mission statement.
Well, Sutherland Institute, based in Salt Lake City, is entering its 31st year. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary last year. And in that 30 years, we've developed a model where we advance our mission by producing events, content, and people that drive the policy narrative, build coalitions all around enacting and defending sound laws, based on, again, that mission statement you talked about. So we produce policy research, hold events as kind of platforms to elevate an issue and elevate kind of reasonable dialogue, thoughtful conversation that rises above polarization and partisan talking points to try to really drive at solutions around our mission, but also our core values, which include being principled and data-driven, being thoughtful and nonpartisan, and around partnerships and trust in the policy space between or our organization, elected officials, those adjacent to the policymaking process, like other nonprofits and advocacy groups and things. And again, what we're really trying to do is cut through a lot of the rancor, cut through a lot of the times of just speaking past each other with talking points, and actually based on evidence, based on sound ideas, and actual solutions to problems, advance solutions in at a time when that can be a challenge, whether that's in Washington, D.C. or at the state level. It's kind of bleeding out everywhere. And but that's something that's happened before in our history. This is not the only time where it's been difficult to get things done. You look at for instance, if you just look at it, measured by things like attacks from the media on or not from, but through the media on elected officials on things like that. Yeah, it was actually worse at the beginning of the nation's founding, right, when after the Constitution was enacted, and so we've actually had worse, even though it's hard to feel that way, right? It's hard to recognize the way that was a long time ago. But again, you read some of what was said there, and we still worked our way through that, figured out how to continue the American experiment and find ways to get solutions accomplished that allow governance to happen and people to just live their lives and do the things that they're really focused on. And so that's what we strive for. We think Utah, we're based in Utah. We focus a lot in Utah at the state level, but we kind of have an 80-20 or 70-30 model where 20 to 30% of what we do, our focus is outside the state boundaries of Utah. And a lot of that is about elevating what we think Utah has to offer to the rest of the nation, whether that's examples of policy solutions, whether that's examples of how to go about things in a polarized political world in order to actually enact solutions. And so that's kind of that's what our work is.
Well, I love your focus on the historical perspective, Derek, and reminding us that we've been in tough times in this country before. It's something we reflect on a lot at American Promise, and it kind of takes away the excuse from us getting through this and doing better, because certainly our grandparents, great grandparents, and their grandparents all went through as tough times and carried the torch of freedom forward for the country. And and it's something that we just have to remember. It's our turn to do what we need to do now, and the fact that it's tough does welcome to the world, right?
Well, and
That's the way it is.
welcome to the responsibility of being a free citizen in a free country. You know, things are
Yeah.
going to be challenging. The idea of a representative government freedom is kind of the exception in the history of the world, and oftentimes those kind of experiments didn't last long. And the United States is, the exception, one of the exceptions to that one. We want to keep it that way, but that does mean dealing with difficult things and facing those things. And maybe, this one other thing I should have emphasized when it comes to our mission. The tools we have available to us facing those things include the institutions around us, that we're a part of. That has always been a feature of American life from all the way back Alexis de Tocqueville in the founding era, in the 1800s. That one thing that allows this American political culture and American experiment to work is that we're not just relying on government for everything or ourselves for everything. There's a whole bunch of groups in the middle, families and nonprofits and churches and our businesses, our workplaces, where we interact and we allow those things to interact in ways that find solutions for people that don't always require a new government program. But oftentimes it does require government that's willing to work with those institutions and in some instances just get out of the way. In other instances, we actually need the government to step in and be involved in certain ways in working with those institutions, but not to replace them, simply to support them and allow individuals to kind of work out their lives that way through the associations we have in our communities. And I think that's an important part of the solution to what we're experiencing today.
Yeah, it's de Tocqueville talked about Derek the to him striking thing about American society, even in those early 1800s days, that when there was a problem, Americans formed associations.
That's
They
right.
gathered together. They worked to solve the problem, and we certainly take that spirit with American Promise. We saw a problem, and what do we do? Well, we form an association, talk to our fellow Americans, pull us together, and let's roll up our sleeves and solve this problem. So,
Yeah.
couldn't agree more. And you've been at it 20 years nearly now at the Sutherland Institute. That's
Yep.
given you some good perspective. Share a little bit, if you would, with our listeners about Utah, about the political evolution there you've seen over the past couple of decades, and if you could spend a little time unpacking federalism a little bit for our listeners. What it means, how healthy it is now compared, to what you've seen over your nearly 2 decades of work with the Institute.
Well, one thing that we think Utah has going for it is, your question was kind of perfect segue from what we were just talking about because it really is the institutions that continue to thrive here. Our political culture, it's being polarized in different ways, like everywhere. But the elected officials and others in the space still strive to solve problems, to get things accomplished for people, and to do so in ways that are based on kind of fundamental principles and ideas that we may debate about, but that generally everybody has an interest in. Things like equality, things like freedom, things in the Declaration of Independence that we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of that we argue about, and we've been arguing about for 250 years. But that just means we care about them, which is what makes them worth arguing about. And so, we have things like that in our politics, but then outside of political spheres and the government, we have, a thriving business sector, a state that welcomes and still, people strive to form families at some level or another, and then thriving kind of civic institutions like churches and membership organizations, nonprofits, volunteer kind of organizations that people can be a part of and that they enjoy being a part of. And so that's, I think, what Utah has on its kind of strengths list, among other things. We're still facing, however, the same challenges that exist elsewhere, and in some cases have unique challenges. Being a Western state, there are a lot of limitations, and this starts to get into the federalism question you raised. There are a lot of limitations on things like land use. You cross the Rocky Mountains, and the majority of the land is actually not privately controlled like it is east of the Rockies in every state east of the Rockies. In Utah's case, I think we're somewhere around two-thirds. It's federal land, and a lot of that is like uses that we all appreciate and support, things like national parks, and then a lot of it is um, just land that kind of just sits there and has no kind of uses and is kind of restricted from use. And that's just a challenge that other states don't face. Um and it presents a challenge for federalism because it raises this question, whatever you think about public lands, and that's not really the issue I'm trying to raise, but whatever you think about public lands, there's a question of where does the line between the proper, role of the federal government and of federal decisions in the federal court system, from Congress, from the presidency, where does that line end? And should we just allow states, whether it be Utah, Nebraska, New York, California, the ability to kind of make their own decisions and not kind of be restricted as much by federal decision making? So, I mean, I think the status of federalism is an interesting question today because you have a moment where you have an administration that seems more interested and willing to let go of some things. When it comes, for instance, in education. And again, whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea, it's what they're striving to do. And at the same time, that's going to resonate with, well, sorry, that's going to resonate with Republicans, right? What they're doing in the areas like education. But at the same time, you have a lot of concerns from the other side of the partisan aisle about what the administration is doing, and they, outside of education areas, for instance, and they're wanting to kind of protect themselves or insulate themselves from some of those decisions, the policy decisions they disagree with. So you have this unique moment where it's not simply one partisan or one political party's in power and the other political party at the state level disagrees and believes in federalism. You actually have both sides kind of engaging at the state level in federalism. And it's a unique moment and one where I think we can have these conversations about where those boundaries are, and maybe establish a more sustainable, politically and in partisan ways, sustainable way of navigating these questions about what's the proper federal authority, what's the proper state authority on any given issue, and one where it's not just going to fall to those partisan talking points of depends on who's in power in the White House, kind of a thing. So I think that is a promising, hopeful thing amidst all the partisan rancor, amidst the polarization, that there are unique opportunities as well. And in federalism in particular, those exist.
Well, let's drill in on one of them. The way money in politics works today in America. And last year, Utah became the 23rd state to formally call for a constitutional amendment that would return decisions about that, about how money works or should work in elections to the elected lawmakers in the states. The vote was overwhelming, 63 to 9 in the House, 20 to 4 in the Senate. And I want to ask you, Derek, why did this issue resonate so strongly with lawmakers there in Utah?
Well, in Utah, we have a strong affinity for federalism, for within the areas that are not particularly assigned to the federal government in the U.S. Constitution, to have a robust state presence and authority over what decisions are made. And money in politics is one of those. Um, the Constitution is clear on when it comes to election policy, including things like how money is regulated in politics, campaign finance, that the states are kind of the leaders, and that Congress can also amend things. They can pass laws as well. But it's a balance, but it's looking to the states first and foremost. And so, through that framework, the current situation kind of imposed by the federal court system a long time ago now, that restricts a lot of activity, whether you want to regulate or step back on regulation when it comes to campaign finance and money in politics, for us is concerning because, again, the free speech, which is what those federal court rulings largely are based on. We believe in free speech. We believe that needs to be protected. But we also recognize that whether it's the federal court system, whether it's the federal government through Congress or the federal agencies, they can overreach at times. And this is one of those places. So yeah, we do believe that federalism ought to be the guiding principle in all of this when it comes to money and politics, and that Utah cares about that significantly. We're in a state where um, Utah is a ballot initiative state, where ballot initiatives are allowed. They're not precluded by our Constitution. And increasingly there's been more activity in that space. And that's fine. That's has nothing really to do so much with money in politics, but there are layers of money in politics that influence it. For instance, should foreign governments be able to invest their funds, in trying to influence state laws? And that's an issue that our people, Utahns, care about, voters care about, and elected officials care about. And so the idea that it's possible for free speech considerations, that based on previous court rulings, that might be something that we actually have to be careful about, is where, okay, that shouldn't even be a question, right? That is a clear and compelling national interest, let alone state interest, in protecting laws and the integrity of our laws based on the concerns and the interests of voters and residents in the state of Utah, not foreign governments who may be adversarial to those interests at times. And so that's just one kind of particular area that resonates a lot in Utah. But the other is, again, just the ability of the state to simply say, hey, our campaign finance policy ought to be ours. And you can have yours in your state, and that's great. And people can figure out what makes the most sense for them based on the campaign finance dynamics that they experience.
Yeah, well, we've had several state lawmakers from around the country on this podcast, and the foreign money in their state elections is really troubling. And indeed, federal courts, they tell us in Maine, for example, have blocked efforts by the state to prohibit foreign government spending in their state elections. And so I can understand why that's a concern in Utah as well. So thanks for sharing that, Derek. Um, Share a little bit more, though. The Utah legislature is now behind, the state of Utah is now behind a constitutional amendment solution to this problem that would put that power back in the hands of the states once ratified by the process of a two-thirds vote in Congress and ratification by three-quarters of the state legislatures. So share a little bit more, if you would, of how this resolution out of Utah and the amendment aligns with Sutherland's broader mission. Why are you getting involved in this issue that really obviously affects Utah for the reasons you said, but it is a significant national constitutional issue, of course, too. And we'd love to hear your perspective on Sutherland's alignment with that, if you would.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the proposal, the most resonant element of it is that maybe no surprise is that it's federalism driven, and it's not putting its finger on the scale toward any particular campaign finance regime or regulation. The fact that it simply says states have the authority to step into the area of campaign finance, money in politics, and make the rules that they think ought to be in place, while still protecting freedom of speech, protecting other considerations, that those protections don't preclude states from making the decisions that are best for their people. That's, I think, the most resonant element of it. It's not about an agenda of how we do campaign finance anywhere. It's not about some trying to advantage one side versus the other. It's simply about saying it's reasonable that we have concerns about how money influences our politics, and it's reasonable, therefore, and protected in the Constitution to make rules around those things while, again, maintaining protections for other parts of constitutional liberties that are also important. That's, I think, been the most resonant thing for us and for state lawmakers in the state of Utah generally. Again, we have an affinity for federalism here. It's something that's kind of in our political DNA. And so that approach is very resonant for those reasons.
Yeah, I understand you're doing a white paper soon to be released about that, about this issue and federalism. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yes. So federalism as a concept is one that, you say it and people's, eyes start to glaze over potentially, the average person. And so what wanted to do was, okay, what does that really mean? Why does it matter? And not in terms of principle, but in terms of realities and things that people do care about because they hear about it and say, oh yeah, that's important. So one example from the white paper that we're highlighting is the political pressures and financial pressures of trying to run for office, and the pressures that money exerts on that endeavor are different in, say, a state like New York, where a lot of money is coming from Wall Street firms, and state of Utah, where money is coming maybe more so from things like extractive industries, mining interests and things like that, where we have a lot of natural resources. And so we ought to be able to recognize those differences in how we regulate campaign finance. The other thing is, again, just comparing New York to Utah, the cost of campaigning in a kind of a very expensive media market like New York are going to be much different than a, still costly, but maybe not the highest cost media market in Salt Lake City. And so things that influence things like how much can people contribute to a campaign. Well, if it's going to just by nature cost more in New York to do that, it would make sense that those limits maybe ought to be higher, and potentially significantly higher, just kind of as a rule of the road than in a state like Utah or even more rural state than Utah. Um, so those kinds of just basic common sense dynamics ought to be something that shouldn't be precluded because we have a blanket rule across the country based on a judicial decision. And that's what our political decisions are for. Our political processes are for, is to kind of get into those weeds and make those decisions based on what's the experiences on the ground that we're experiencing. And it's again very concerning that judges might step in and just take away the ability to consider those things. That's not what the judiciary is for. It's not meant to end discussions or preclude discussions, but it's just to interpret the Constitution and what it says and what it means, and then let the political branches and the political processes of the legislature, the executive, uh, within those rules, then go and make the decisions that are best for their people.
The vote in Utah certainly reflected a broad consensus of viewpoint about that. It does seem like the support there, as we've seen elsewhere, is really seriously cross-partisan and throughout the state. And I know Sutherland, you mentioned as you were describing the work of Sutherland Institute, how important it is that you guys are helping to build trust with lawmakers and communities who may come from different perspectives. And whether on this issue or others, how do you really go about that? Could you share a little bit more using the example of the vote in Utah that happened, or another one if you wish? Just a constitutional amendment, of course, requires a lot of cross-partisan and civic uh, participation of the American people. And what advice do you have from Sutherland's approach on building trust with lawmakers and communities from different perspectives?
I think it's important to recognize that in our current political environment, people from different political parties oftentimes speak different languages. And it's easy to alienate or gain support from one side or the other simply by the words you use. And so, as we've engaged on this issue and in federalism generally, we've been very sensitive to that fact. And that has really helped us working with this proposal, the For Our Freedom Amendment, to help people understand that it doesn't just benefit one side. It is benefiting and protecting all partisan perspectives, really. And when we've been able to make that case, when we've been able to kind of speak those kind of foreign languages of sorts politically, then people start to understand, okay, I get why this is a good idea. Um, and again, that gets back to the need to get beyond partisan talking points. When we get into that rut of just kind of spouting the talking points of partisan interest, you know, you lose opportunities to help someone from a different political perspective see what the value is in what you're doing. And so it just becomes valuable to think through what's being said. And that's kind of was our approach when it comes to the For Our Freedom Amendment, the resolution in support of it is to be careful with the language, recognize that different perspectives are representing valid things. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking only my partisan team has anything of value, or is trying to do good things. And as you actually interact with folks regularly who have a different partisan stripe, you start to realize how false that is and how much of a kind of just a false narrative it represents. And then that opens up doors, has been our experience for things like talking about this amendment, talking about the value it produces to allow states to go their own ways, um, that is broadly resonant across political interests, ideological spectrums, and partisan spectrums as well.
Yeah, for sure. And Derek, you mentioned we are celebrating 250 years of independence this year. We've been through a lot as Americans over these 2.5 centuries. Let me ask you, what gives you hope now for our country, Derek?
Well, with every kind of challenging time, there is new opportunity. I think that's true in individual lives. It's true in, groups like families or communities, but it's true also in states and nations. And so I think, again, the discussion earlier of the more broadly resonant interest in federalism is a perfect example. And as we celebrate 250 years of our kind of independence and our nation's existence, remembering kind of what our nation is founded on is a new opportunity. It's an opportunity for hope because these celebrations aren't about what party you're a part of. They aren't about who's in power and who's not. They're about being an American and recognizing the ideas that America is based on, which are captured in our Declaration of Independence as well as our Constitution, are things that we all care about, even when we disagree about them. And having a non-partisan, not uh, highly political opportunity to talk about those things, to remember those things, is an opportunity to kind of reconnect to them in a way that surpasses polarization and maybe plants seeds to overcome it over time. And so I think that's an opportunity as well, just this particular year. Um, Despite whatever circumstance we may find ourselves in politically, there's always opportunity to grow and be better. And you see the hope, I think, actually in the number of people that actually are trying to endeavoring to overcome these challenges. It's easy to kind of feel like, oh gosh, are we the only ones? And the truth is, the answer to that question is no. And you really don't have to look very far. You don't have to look outside maybe your comfort zones. You have to look outside your political streams of information to see and to recognize other people doing that. But once you do, the opportunities for impact and to change these dynamics little by little, accumulating over time to big change, are broad and rampant.
Yeah. I think if de Tocqueville came back today, he'd recognize a certain American trait still going
Yeah.
of figuring out, even when the times are tough, what do we got to do to fix them and getting together and getting started on it. So, um, glad to hear that gives you hope, gives me hope, and so many others. We're so grateful for you being with us today, Derek Monson, the Sutherland Institute. Thank you so much, Derek.
Thank you, Jeff.